guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to share how to grow Cattleya orchids. So I have a collection of 200 different orchids and Hoyas, and 70% of that are Cattleya orchids. These are some of my favorite orchids. They're so fragrant, they're so rewarding to grow, and I really love them. This one smells like lemon sorbet. I love this one. Newer growers start with Phalaenopsis orchids and they move on to Cattleya, Dendrobium, and other types of orchids. And then they don't know how to get those orchids to bloom. So in today's video, I want to share some tips on how to get these orchids to grow, especially if you're stuck in not getting them to bloom. I have 6 tips for you that will help you finally getting them to flower for you. So let's jump right in. Okay, so the first tip is super important, and I would say it's the most important thing that you have to do with your Cattleya orchids, and it's give them sufficient light. So if your Cattleya orchid isn't blooming, chances are it's not getting enough light. So Cattleya is like really bright indirect light. You can grow them on a southern facing window, provided you have a little sheer curtain there, or make sure that it's not getting very bright afternoon light that will scorch the leaves. An east-facing window is pretty good for it, but I would stay away from a west-facing window because that's too intense. And a north-facing window, at least in the northern hemisphere, you're not going to get enough light. If you are in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. You want a north-facing window. I grow under LED lights. You can grow under any kinds of lights. I personally use the botanical LED lights, and those work really well for me. But there are other kinds of lights. My mom uses the Barina lights. I have them all linked down below if you want to check them out. Those are good. Cheap lights are good. Like, there's so many different kinds of lights that you can get. Even shop lights are decent nowadays. But the key, if you're growing under LED lights, is you want your orchids to be relatively close to the lights. So I typically put my orchids about a foot away. If they are smaller or the lights are not as intense, I put them about 8 inches away from the lights, and that will give them intense enough light to help them to bloom. So that's my number 1 tip in growing Cattleya orchids. Okay, tip number 2 is to maintain optimal temperatures for Cattleya orchids. So Cattleyas typically like it pretty warm, and I would say they like the temperatures between about 60 and 85 degrees. If it's too cold, they won't grow as fast. If it's too hot, they might be a little too stressed. Now, I do find that my grow room gets very, very hot in the summer and I don't have issues. But you don't want them to stay too cold. Maybe even 65 degrees is a better low-end temperature. But if you're growing them and say it's constantly 50s or 60 degrees, they're not getting that warmth that they need to grow well, you might get stuck. So I would say they have to be kept between 65 and 80 degrees, and that's about 18 to 27 degrees Celsius. One other tip that I would give is the temperature needs to fluctuate at night for a little bit. So they need a differential of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius between day and night, which is what they usually get in the wild. They get a difference between day and night. Here, that's easy to provide in my grow room because during the day, the lights are on and it provides more heat. And then when the lights are off, the temperatures do drop down. Let me actually see. So right now it's 85 degrees and the low was 64 and the high 86. Pretty hot. Again, it does get hotter as we get warmer in the summer. And I don't cool this room, but something that I do sometimes is I open up a window as well to help with the temperatures, getting them down. So give them a day and night differential if you can. Usually pretty easy to do with lights, and if you have them near a windowsill, that should happen pretty naturally. Tip number 3 is to water your Cattleya orchids thoroughly. So I have a lot of my Cattleya orchids in bark. This one has bark and moss in it, but you want to water very thoroughly and let the water drain completely through the pot. So I water, let it drain right through the pot, then I put it back in the decorative pot. You don't want to overwater these or it could rot the roots. So you don't want any water sitting in the pot. That could usually decline some of your Cattleya orchids. So you don't want that. So you want to water very thoroughly, let it drain, and then bring it back to your windowsill, shelves, etc. That one is pretty simple. I find that Cattleya orchids do well if you water them as they just get dry, so they don't require as much water as the Phalaenopsis. They need abundant water, but they don't have to stay constantly moist. If you water as they are approaching dryness or as they get bone dry, they're good. You just want to water abundantly, let them dry, and then they should be good. Okay, tip number 4 isn't as important, but humidity sometimes is a factor with growing some Cattleya orchids. So if you have extremely low humidity, say 20%, which is what I get in the winter when I have some Cattleya orchids that are growing, sometimes the growths get stuck and inside of the little sheaths and they don't expand properly. But that's just in the winter for me. My humidity tends to be about 40% here. Generally, in the summer it's a lot higher, in the winter a lot lower, but misting your plants and the humidity helps a little bit. I don't find that it makes a huge difference, but if you want really nice and showy flowers, if you're able to keep your humidity levels between 50 and 70%, that's ideal. It's not completely necessary. Like I said, I get blooms at 40% humidity and they're totally fine, but this is just if you want to give them an extra boost. So tip number 5 is fertilizer. So as your orchids are growing in the spring and summer, you want to fertilize pretty regularly. I like to use MSU fertilizer. MSU fertilizer includes calcium and magnesium in it, which some commercial fertilizers don't include. And a lot of orchids thrive on calcium and magnesium. I like to fertilize half strength in the spring and summer, and in the winter, maybe every other week, or I'll give them maybe quarter strength, maybe even a little less than that. But if you fertilize them, they grow nice and strong, and it'll help the growths bloom. So Cattleyas bloom from every single new growth. So if you are growing a nice strong growth, they're going to reward you with nice flowers. So it all starts in the growing season, making sure that these orchids are getting some sort of fertilizer, some sort of nutrients in them, and then they will reward you with very pretty flowers. Tip number 5 is you want to make sure you're properly potting your orchids. So if you get an orchid from a nursery, you don't know how long it's been in the pot. Generally, I aim to repot every 2 to 3 years. I want to show you this cutie right here. Another nicely fragrant Cattleya orchid. You want to repot every 2 to 3 years. When the bark starts to break down, it's not good for the health of the roots, and those roots can rot as well, or they could break down and turn into a powder, and then it suffocates the roots. So generally, Cattleyas are in some sort of chunky mix, usually bark. They're epiphytes, so they need a lot of air to the roots. Over time, things break down and they get a little dusty. So you want to be pretty on top of your repots. You don't have to repot every year, but I find every 2 to 3 years is optimal. This one I have in clear pot with bark, a tiny bit of moss, and it has very healthy roots. Let me show you. This one's growing really nicely, and this one is going to stay here for about, we'll see. If the growth gets over the pot, I'm going to have to repot it sooner, but I'm not planning on repotting it this spring because the roots look good in here. If you guys want to check out a video where I repot a Cattleya orchid, check out this link right here. And I also have other videos on what kind of potting media you can use for your orchids as well, because there's so much that you can grow these in. Okay, the last tip, which is tip number 6, is that these orchids need proper air circulation. So if you're growing on a windowsill, perfect. You're able to perhaps open a window and give them some air. If it is winter and they can't get air, they need a fan or something constantly circulating air, because constant air circulation will prevent fungus and bacterial infections. So you definitely want to make sure that these are getting plenty of air. I have an oscillating fan in this room that I have on 24/7, and that makes sure that these orchids are doing good, that they're not spreading anything to each other. And if I miss them or water them, it allows that to dry quickly and not spread any sort of bacteria. So that's really important as well. If you follow these tips, you'll be ready to see blooms in no time. I love Cattleya orchids. These blooms tend to last between, depending on the orchid, depending on the temperatures, they can last between 2 weeks to a month. I love the fragrance on these. They're so nice. They can last 2 weeks to a month, so they last really long. When the blooms are spent, such as this one over here, when the blooms are spent, you could cut off the little spikes, and then you want to give them proper care so a new growth can emerge, and then it starts all over again. I'm confident once you give these orchids enough light, air circulation, you're fertilizing them, you're giving them warmer temperatures, they're gonna bloom for you. Don't forget that the biggest factor is light. If you can get an LED grow light, if you're not getting enough light in your house or your apartment, or if you don't grow outdoors or in a greenhouse, LED light is gonna make all the difference. A little lamp, something like that, but you'll be able to bloom your Cattleya orchids. It's not super hard. They just need a little bit more light than Phalaenopsis orchids. It's not hard. They just need more light than Phalaenopsis orchids. They don't have to be watered as much. They can tolerate a lot more neglect, actually, which is what makes these some of my favorite orchids. And I know, like, when I go away on a trip once a year, if I were to not water my Cattleya orchids for 2 weeks, I wouldn't even sweat it because my established orchids are not even really going to get stressed out. They're very hardy. So highly recommend them. If you haven't tried a Cattleya orchid, definitely go for it, and you're gonna love it. Once you smell them, you're just gonna keep buying more. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.